Imagine kissing your wife goodbye, leaving for work like it's any other day, and then disappearing without a trace. No body. No final phone call. Just a letter claiming your family would be better off without you. For 15 years, Elizabeth Welsh and her 2 sons believed Patrick Welsh was dead. They grieved him. They rebuilt their lives without him. And eventually, they tried to make peace with the idea that the husband and father they loved had taken his own life. But then, in 1997, one letter changed everything. It didn't come from Patrick. It came from the Social Security Administration. And buried inside that letter was a sentence so shocking it would destroy everything Elizabeth thought she knew about her husband. Patrick Welsh wasn't dead. He had never died at all. While his wife and sons were struggling to survive in Ohio, Patrick had been living under a new name, in another state, building an entirely different life as if his family had never existed. And once investigators started pulling that second life apart, the case became even more disturbing. Because Patrick Welsh hadn't just disappeared. He had erased himself and left the people who loved him to live with the damage. If you enjoy true crime stories that sound too unbelievable to be real, subscribe now, because this case only gets more shocking from here. In the early 1980s, Patrick Welsh looked like the kind of man who had already built the life most people spend years chasing. He lived in Lancaster, Ohio, with his wife Elizabeth and their 2 young sons, Chris and Ted. From the outside, they looked like a stable middle-class family trying to do what millions of American families were doing at the time: raise their children, pay their bills, and keep moving forward. Patrick had worked in fundraising and public relations, and by the time he disappeared, he was employed at Lancaster Fairfield Community Hospital. Elizabeth was focused on holding the family together and raising their boys. To the people around them, they didn't look like a family on the verge of collapse. They looked normal, familiar. The kind of family you pass every day without ever imagining their story would one day end up in newspapers across multiple states. But underneath that image, there was already a problem Patrick could never fully outrun. A few years earlier, he had been convicted of embezzling money from Ohio State University, where he had worked as a fundraiser. The amount wasn't small. It was enough to leave a permanent stain on his reputation, enough to create financial pressure, and enough to force his family to live under the shadow of a scandal they never asked for. Even after the conviction, Patrick still owed thousands of dollars in restitution. That matters because when Patrick disappeared, the people closest to him didn't think he had vanished for no reason. They believed they already knew why. By January of 1983, Patrick was carrying more than just the ordinary stress of work and family life. He was carrying humiliation, debt, and the weight of a public fall from grace. And according to the version of events his family would soon be forced to accept, that pressure had finally broken him. On January 21, 1983, Patrick kissed his wife goodbye, said goodbye to his sons, and left home as if it were a completely ordinary morning. There was nothing dramatic about it. No final speech. No obvious warning. No sign that this would be the last time his family would ever see him. He simply walked out the door and drove away. But when evening came, Patrick never returned home. At first, that might not sound terrifying. Adults can run late. Cars break down. Unexpected things happen. But as the hours passed, it became clear that this wasn't a delay. Patrick Welsh had vanished. And then, just as Elizabeth was trying to make sense of where her husband could have gone, something arrived that changed the entire meaning of his disappearance. A letter. And inside that letter, Patrick claimed he had done the unthinkable. The next day, Patrick's car was found abandoned on the Ohio River Bridge near Portsmouth, more than 100 miles from home. Inside the vehicle, there was a letter. It was addressed to Elizabeth. And the message inside was devastating. Patrick wrote that he couldn't live with the shame of what he had done. He said he felt like a failure, that his family would be better off without him, and that he planned to jump from the bridge into the river below. To Elizabeth, it was the kind of note that leaves no room for hope. There was no explanation about where he was going. No promise that he would come back. Just a final message that made it sound as though Patrick had decided to end his life and disappear forever beneath the water. Authorities immediately began treating the case as a likely suicide. Search crews were brought in. The area around the bridge was examined. Investigators looked for any sign that Patrick might still be nearby. But they found nothing. No body. No witness who had seen him jump. No final trace of where he had gone after abandoning the car. And yet, for Elizabeth, the note was enough to change everything. She was suddenly a single mother with 2 boys, left to explain to them that their father was probably gone forever. There would be no funeral, no final goodbye, no body to bury. Just a bridge, a letter, and a silence that seemed to confirm the worst. In the years that followed, that silence became its own kind of punishment. Elizabeth had to raise her sons alone while carrying the emotional weight of Patrick's disappearance and the financial damage he had left behind. Patrick's earlier embezzlement conviction had already put the family under pressure. Now, with Patrick gone, Elizabeth was left to deal with the fallout by herself. And for a long time, she did what many grieving families do when there are no answers. She tried to accept the version of the story she had been given. Patrick had been overwhelmed. Patrick had felt trapped. Patrick had gone to the bridge and ended his life. That was the explanation everyone was expected to live with. And for years, they did. But there was one problem. Patrick Welsh's body was never found. Not in the river. Not downstream. Not anywhere. And as time passed, that missing body would become harder and harder to ignore. Because if Patrick really had jumped that day, then where had he gone? For years, Patrick Welsh's disappearance remained frozen in time. No body was ever recovered from the river. No one came forward claiming they had seen him jump. No credible sighting placed him alive somewhere else. And because the note in his car sounded so final, the case slowly settled into the kind of quiet that surrounds old tragedies people assume will never be solved. Elizabeth kept moving forward because she had no other choice. She raised Chris and Ted alone. She tried to rebuild a life that had been shattered in a single day. And like so many families left without answers, they were forced to live with a strange kind of grief, one that never felt completely finished. Patrick had vanished so completely that there was nothing left to hold on to except the story he had left behind. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. Patrick's disappearance had created legal and financial problems that didn't simply disappear with him. There were still questions tied to his past, including the money he owed after his embezzlement conviction. And over time, those loose ends forced people to look at his case again. Then, in 1997, 14 years after Patrick vanished, Elizabeth received a letter from the Social Security Administration. At first, it didn't look like the kind of thing that could blow open a cold case. It was just an official notice, the kind of letter most people would open without a second thought. But inside was information so bizarre that Elizabeth could barely process it. The Social Security Administration wanted to know why Patrick Welsh was using a different Social Security number. Not why someone had stolen his identity. Not why there had been an error in the records. Why Patrick himself was using another number. In that instant, the entire story of Patrick's death began to collapse. Because if Patrick had died in 1983, there would be no reason for the government to believe he was actively using anything. But if Patrick was alive, then the note, the abandoned car, the bridge, and the years of grief his family had endured had all been built on a lie. Investigators began digging, and what they found was almost impossible to believe. Patrick Welsh had not died on that bridge. He had vanished on purpose. And for more than a decade, he had been living under another name in Florida, building a completely different life while his wife and sons in Ohio believed they had lost him forever. But the discovery of Patrick's second life only raised a darker question. If he had been alive all those years, how far had he gone to erase the family he left behind? The man living in Florida was no longer Patrick Welsh. At least, not on paper. By the time investigators tracked him down, he had been going by the name Richard Colson and had spent years carefully building a new identity for himself. He had a home. He had a job. He had created the appearance of an ordinary life in another state while, back in Ohio, the family he left behind had spent more than a decade believing he was dead. It wasn't a momentary escape. It wasn't a breakdown that lasted a few weeks before he came to his senses. Patrick had vanished in 1983 and stayed hidden for years, which meant every part of this second life had been deliberate. At some point after abandoning his car on that bridge, Patrick made the decision not just to leave his family, but to erase them. He had adopted another name, used a different social security number, and moved far enough away that the people who once knew him would never casually cross his path. And as investigators looked closer, the betrayal became even harder to understand. Patrick wasn't living like a man haunted by guilt. He wasn't in hiding in some remote cabin, surviving in fear that someone would recognize him. He had built a normal life. A comfortable one. The kind of life you build when you believe the people you abandoned will never find you. For Elizabeth and her sons, that discovery changed the meaning of everything they had lived through. For 14 years, they had believed Patrick's disappearance was an act of despair, the final decision of a man crushed by shame and financial ruin. But the truth suggested something far colder. Patrick had not gone to that bridge because he saw no other way out. He went there because it gave him the perfect way to disappear. The note no longer looked like a final goodbye. It looked like a script. A carefully written story designed to make sure no one would come looking for him as a living man. And if that was true, then Patrick hadn't just abandoned his family. He had manipulated them into grieving him. He had forced Elizabeth to raise their children alone. He had left his sons to grow up believing their father was dead. And he had done it while starting over somewhere else under another name. But investigators still needed to know one thing. Why would a man go to such extreme lengths to erase his own life? And once Patrick was finally confronted, the answer he gave would only make the betrayal worse. By the time Patrick Welsh was finally confronted, the mystery of where he had been was no longer the biggest question. The real question was why? Why fake a suicide? Why let your wife spend years believing you were dead? Why allow your children to grow up without a father, never once telling them the truth? Patrick's answer was not dramatic. It wasn't the kind of explanation that could justify what he had done. According to reports, he claimed he had simply wanted a fresh start. He said he had been overwhelmed by debt, shame, and the fallout from his criminal conviction, and instead of facing the damage he had caused, he chose to disappear and begin again somewhere no one knew his name. That explanation may have described his decision, but it did nothing to soften it. Because a fresh start for Patrick meant devastation for everyone else. While he was building a second life in Florida, Elizabeth was left to carry the emotional and financial wreckage alone. She had to raise their sons without him. She had to answer impossible questions. She had to live with the image of Patrick's abandoned car on that bridge and the belief that the man she married had chosen death over staying with his family. And for Chris and Ted, the betrayal ran even deeper. They hadn't just lost a father. They had spent years mourning someone who was never actually gone. That kind of discovery changes everything. It doesn't just replace grief with anger. It forces you to question every memory you have of the person you thought you knew. Every goodbye. Every explanation. Every moment spent trying to make peace with their absence suddenly feels like part of a lie they wrote for you. Patrick had not simply walked away from his family. He had made them participants in his disappearance. He had allowed them to carry the pain, the confusion, and the shame while he moved on with his life under another name. And once the truth came out, the reaction in Ohio was exactly what you would expect. People were stunned. Not because Patrick had run from financial trouble. Not because he had lied. But because of how completely he had erased his own family from his life and how long he had gotten away with it. For 14 years, the Welsh family had lived with a wound that never fully healed. Now they had to face something even worse. Patrick had never been lost. He had chosen not to come back. And after that discovery, the final chapter of the case was no longer about whether Patrick was alive. It was about what kind of reckoning was still possible after a betrayal that had lasted almost half a lifetime. In the end, Patrick Welsh's story did not end with a dramatic arrest scene or some cinematic confession. What made the case so disturbing was how ordinary his decision seemed to him. He had simply chosen himself. Chosen escape over responsibility. Chosen a new identity over the family he left behind. Chosen his own comfort over the people forced to live with the consequences of his disappearance. Once Patrick was found, the legal system finally had proof that the story his family had been told for years was false. The man they believed had died in 1983 had actually spent more than a decade living somewhere else under another name. The husband Elizabeth had mourned and the father Chris and Ted had grown up missing had never been gone at all. But even with that truth in hand, there was no clean ending waiting for the Welsh family. There was no way to give Elizabeth those years back. No way to undo the birthdays, holidays, and milestones Patrick had chosen to miss. No way to erase the pain of knowing that while they were grieving him, he had been alive and fully capable of contacting them at any moment. That is what makes Patrick Welsh's case so unsettling. It wasn't built around one act of violence or one explosive moment. It was built around a quieter kind of cruelty, the decision to let the people closest to you suffer so you can walk away from the life you no longer want. For Elizabeth and her sons, the truth didn't bring closure in the way people often imagine. It brought a different kind of wound. Instead of wondering whether Patrick had died in despair, they were forced to confront the reality that he had lived in comfort while they carried the burden of his disappearance. And maybe that's the most chilling part of this entire story. Patrick Welsh didn't vanish because no one could find him. He vanished because he believed the people who loved him would eventually stop looking. For 14 years, that belief protected him. It let him build a second life while his first family was left to pick through the wreckage. And when the truth finally surfaced, the case exposed something far more disturbing than a fake suicide. It exposed a man who was willing to turn his own death into a lie, if it meant he never had to face the damage he had caused. Stories like this are a reminder that sometimes the people who disappear are not lost at all. Sometimes they are exactly where they want to be. And the people they leave behind are the ones forced to live with the consequences.